Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Burris, and I am the co-chair of the Library Lecture Series here at Wake Forest. And it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Mustafa Abdullah. Just a couple of housekeeping rules for you. Mustafa will be taking questions during his lecture, but he will acknowledge you if you just raise your hand at a particular point during his talk today. But please feel free to ask questions throughout. Also, I'll begin my introduction with a few words that Mustafa has asked me to say on his behalf. He is, as a result of Imam Grigg's consistent use of the title, commonly known as the tallest Muslim in Winston-Salem. In addition, he is more than likely the tallest graduate of Wake Forest who did not play for the basketball team. Now, while he may have rendered his height useless and pointless by not continuing to play ball, he currently devotes his skills and passions to his position as Associate Organizer for Change, which is a local nonprofit, nonpartisan, multi-faith, multiracial organization that is made up of 53 dues-paying congregations from around the city. In addition, he devotes his time to the community as a Winston-Salem Human Relations Commissioner, and as a member of Generation Change, which was an initiative by Farah Pandit, who is a member of the State Department as the Special U.S. Representative to Muslim Communities. And this is a group of young Muslims, leaders from across the country, who were asked to attend Secretary of State Clinton's iftar this past September, along with other world leaders, to begin leading projects and discussions on developing Muslim communities domestically and internationally. And one more addition to Mr. Abdullah's pedigree is that he was last year's Building the Dream Award winner for the Martin Luther King celebrations for both Winston-Salem State and Wake Forest. So, without further ado, Mustafa Abdullah.
So, as I was reflecting on what exactly I was going to say today, I was trying to figure out how as an American Egyptian Muslim, does the life and the teachings of Dr. King motivate me or interact or engage with the work that I had completed mostly prior to winning the award. And I was thinking about the discourse of how we define Dr. King. What is the mainstream language that we use to talk about him? And in that process, I did some reading, and I was reminded of the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, who said that the problem of the 20th century will be the problem of the color line. And yes, but of course, that prediction was absolutely correct, without a doubt. In this country, in the 20th century, we have struggled with issues of Jim Crow. Internationally, we've had the issues with apartheid in South Africa. In India, there was the issue of colonialism and Mahatma Gandhi's movement, a nonviolent movement to resist the elements of this colonialism. And so there's no other character or leader in this country that has done more considering issues of race than Martin Luther King. But oftentimes, we simply define him within that framework, within that category. He is a racialized icon. He stands for the issues of black and white. But my hope today is to try to shed some light on how, personally, as an American Egyptian Muslim, he has inspired me to participate in the democratic process, because he was, I believe, the first visionary for pluralism in this country. He called upon people of every faith, race, ethnic background to come together and to participate in the nonviolent movement, to participate in peace building, to participate in the development of communities. And this need to reflect on Dr. King in such a way is no more evident or necessary than at any other time in our recent history, particularly here in the city of Winston-Salem. So this question may have arisen in some of your discourses, or maybe in your mind as you're looking at me right now, which is the question of, are you a terrorist? And this is a question that I faced a number of times, and actually this past summer I was asked to speak several times at different churches and community gatherings, particularly during July and August, to talk about the Islamophobia and to talk about the issues surrounding the Islamic Center in Manhattan. And the language and the rhetoric that was used to describe this issue became so inflammatory on both sides that no one was seemingly in the public willing to try to build relationships, to step outside of each other's comfort zones. And so I had been giving one of these discussions, and the next week I was in my office doing some work with our lead organizer and doing some work with our office manager, and a gentleman comes and knocks on the door. And he says, "Mustafa, do you have a minute?" And I remembered this gentleman from the last talk, and I remember seeing him in the back of the crowd, and he didn't engage too much. But he said, I have a question. I have a really stupid question. Are you a terrorist? And I remember Ryan sitting at his desk, and he's on the phone, and he's whispering, "I gotta call you back." And he just turns, and our office manager turns from his desk as he was busy typing, and time slowed down, and the tension was rising. And in that moment, you try to think of the prudent thing to say. I had a choice. I had a choice to say, "Who the hell do you think you are?" coming in and using this kind of language. Or, "Tell me, why are you here asking me that question?" And it seemed almost of second nature, because as a Muslim that has often, whose religion has often been victimized by language in the public discourse, it's easy for me to give in to the idea that he is racist, that he really does inherently hate me. But I decided to ask him, "Why'd you ask that question?" And he said, "Well, I organize the Sunday programs at my church here locally, and I proposed to our church body that we bring in a Muslim to come speak about Islam at one of our Sunday programs. And when I had expressed that idea to them, they went up in arms, and a Wake Forest professor, that's a member of the congregation, took me aside and said, 'We can't be in relationship with Muslims because all Muslims are terrorists.' So he said, 'I had to come and ask you.' And so we continued to talk, and I realized in that conversation the importance of Dr. King's conviction in the work that he did. There was a time, actually, when he was in Harlem in 1950, I believe it was 1958, and he was walking through the streets protesting peacefully, and an angry black woman came and stabbed him. And Dr. King's response was to find out who this woman was, and he found out that she was deranged. She was a sick person. And so he went to the courthouse and he sought pardon. And she was granted pardon. And so I'm reminded that those teachings of prudence, those teachings of Dr. King in regards to helping to break a formidable silence however small or however large, between peoples, is perhaps the greatest challenge facing what I would now call the faith line, or the ideological line. In continuing with trying to better understand who was King inspired by? Where did he find such conviction to participate in such efforts despite the gravest endeavors to make him afraid? And I look no further than Howard Thurman. And reportedly, Dr. King is said to have carried Reverend Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited, everywhere that he went. And so, Jesus and the Disinherited breaks up the book is broken up into 3 different parts, talking about the different ills of the community: hate, deceit, and fear, and expressing that the love-centered ethic of Jesus is the response that is needed to deal with these ills. So here's the quote. He explains that Reverend Thurman says that there is a necessity for forgiveness of injury perpetuated against any person by a group. The disinherited man has a sense of gross injury. He finds it well nigh impossible to forgive because his injury is often gratuitous. It is not for something that he has done, an action resulting from a deliberate violation of another. He is penalized for what he is in the eyes and the standards of another. Somehow he must free himself of the will to retaliation that keeps alive his hatred. And so I found myself reading this, and I found that the inspiration and the reasoning for maybe what I did was embedded in the Christian faith. And as a Muslim reading this, I found myself being inspired. And you realize that the importance of telling stories is an incredibly profitable endeavor. Because, as Dr. King was talking about in his I Have a Dream speech, he was illustrating the stories of his children. He was illustrating the stories of his people. He constantly was referring to the story of Jesus and using that as a means of mobilizing. And even in the face of being criticized or accused, he makes me realize that we all hurt in so many different ways. And that's the challenge. And so the question is whether you're going to speak up or not. But once you face that question, if you ask yourself that question, you'll quickly realize that if you remain silent, you're still going to be beaten up and bruised, and you might as well remain as mute as this bottle. So, my freshman year, actually, I was at Oglethorpe University for my first 3 semesters. And I immediately became involved in the interfaith work. And just to preface that, my family had moved down here from Winston-Salem, or to Winston-Salem in August of 2001. And we were living beforehand in Western Massachusetts. And my brother was enrolling at Wake Forest, actually, and my mom was looking for a job at Wake Forest. And my parents enrolled me at Forsyth Country Day School, which is out here in Louisville. And it's a largely very wealthy Caucasian Baptist, very conservative school. And so as a result, I stuck out in a number of ways. And it's not to say anything negative about those characteristics, is that when there's very little diversity, you tend to stick out. And so it was already hard enough to make friends, and then September 11th happened. And here I was, this tall, lanky, Muslim who's from like Arabia, and I think they have pyramids there and the Sphinx, and I don't think they have cars, I think they ride camels, but, kind of deal, right? I mean, I'm in 8th grade. And all of a sudden, I'm watching the news, and I see these events unfold. And that was the most confusing, conflicting moment of my life. And here I'm looking at it saying, how can my identities be at war? my father's Egyptian, my mom's American, and I'm Muslim. So I always define myself as an American Egyptian Muslim. And the days and weeks after September 11th, I was continuously being bombarded with questions, mostly, thankfully, in a non-malicious manner. But I found myself being called to represent all Muslims around the world, and being objectified and stereotyped and categorized that I, as Islam, that I represented all Muslims. And I found myself responding to most questions with a simple, I don't know. I honestly have no idea. And so, actually, a couple of students from studying Islam from Wake Forest last year interviewed me on the Story Corps. And they asked me, the Story Corps bus, which is operated by NPR. And so they had asked me, who has influenced your life the most? And I had never revealed this to anyone, but I didn't quite have the revelation in my head as it appeared to me at that moment. And the revelation was, well, you want me to be honest with you? And I took, a seat back in the chair, and I just took a deep breath. And they said, yeah, sure. And I said, well, you realize that breaking the silence takes a lot of trust. And that sound bites have often misquoted Muslims and and the language has been made to use against them. And they said, yes. So I said, okay. Well, the person who single-handedly affected my life the most, without a doubt, is Osama bin Laden. Because if September 11th had not happened, if Osama bin Laden hadn't continuously told me that I couldn't be American and Muslim, then the trajectory of my life would never have been the same. And so I found myself at Oglethorpe University trying to continuously go back to these questions that had been raised in 8th grade. A simple question of how could you be American and Muslim? How do you make sense of this? And trying to articulate an alternative discourse, which I think that there are many alternative discourses, and I don't think that there is one. And so I found myself building relationships with the Jewish students and the Christian students. And in fact, my Jewish friend really worked hard on starting a Jewish student union there. And he said, Mustafa, it would be an honor if I could help you start the Muslim Students Association. And without that inspiration, I probably wouldn't have had the energy or the courage. But here was someone who was a non-Muslim for the first time reaching out to me and saying that I benefit as a Jew from building a community with you. And so we started doing some interfaith programs, and then I decided to go and ask, just off of a whim, the university president, who at the time was Larry Shaw, and I said in a joking way, not thinking that he would actually do it, I said, what would you like to be the academic advisor for the Muslim Students Association? And in that moment, when I asked him, I realized that there's a simple irony here, because President Shaw is a practitioner of the conservative Jewish tradition who grew up in New York. And I'm asking him to work with me, to speak with me as a Muslim. And he said, absolutely, of course, come to my office and we'll talk about this. So I went to his office, and we were talking about different interfaith programs and showing different films and service projects and things like that. And he said, Mustafa, I just have one last question. And I thought I was going to get out of the office. I was so nervous. This was the first time I was in the president's office. This little, freshman. I'm looking around and, very intimidated. And he said, what if tomorrow we wake up and we come to this university and we find out that there's a swastika carved on the door of a Jewish student? Right? What are you going to do about it? And again, I thought this was another time that I was being verbally attacked. And I had to think about it. And I took a deep breath and I said, well, I would call immediately an interfaith prayer on campus and get representatives from the Jewish and the Christian and the Muslim community. And as a Muslim, condemn this. This is not a part of Islam. And he said, just wanted to make sure. And at the following interfaith event that we had on campus, it was a showing of the documentary, great PBS documentary. I highly recommend it. I think it's the best one. It's the best documentary made about the life of the Prophet Muhammad. And it's called Muhammad, the Legacy of a Prophet. And we astoundingly had media from all different kinds of media from around Atlanta. We had almost 200 people show up to this event. And I don't know how it happened, but obviously it's because of the diversity of relationships that we had built. And in my brief talk I had given before showing the film, I referenced Dr. King, and I referenced a story from Dr. King. And what I said was I was inspired by Dr. King when in 1959 he went to India to study Gandhi's legacy and marveled at the religious diversity of the subcontinent and how Gandhi brought people of all faiths and classes together to work non-violently for freedom and justice. When he returned shortly thereafter to Montgomery, and he stepped into the pulpit of this church, he uttered these words: "O God, our gracious Heavenly Father, we thank Thee for the fact that You have defined men and women in all nations, in all cultures. We call You this name. Some call Thee Allah, some call You Elohim, some call You Jehovah, some call You Brahma, some call You the Unmoved Mover." And shortly thereafter, I said this is an exact parallel to a quote within the Quran, a famous quote that's referenced, wherein the translation is, "God has made you into different tribes and nations so that you may come to know one another. And in coming to know one another, this is an example of your piety, but only God will know which of you is most pious." And so there's a sacredness, there's a certain sacredness in Dr. King's message and in the Quran that I found about diversity, about reaching out to different people and having relationships. So I sought to begin to have a movement that would meet these challenges, that would meet the challenges of the silences that needed to be broken between different groups of people. And so shortly thereafter, I decided to start really just focusing more on service projects. And I began working with a friend of mine who I had met through the Interfaith Youth Corps. The Interfaith Youth Corps is the largest national nonprofit interfaith organization, and it's headed by Ibu Patel, who you may have heard of, and he serves on the president's faith-based and neighborhood initiatives. He also regularly writes for the Huffington Post in the On Faith section. And he had started his own nonprofit called World Faith. And he says that the mission of World Faith is to bring people of different backgrounds together to capitalize on the common values present in each of our faiths. And to build and to use that community service to build community, to build institutions of peace. And his vision wasn't just nationally, it was internationally at the time. This is going back about 6 years now. 5 years, sorry, 5 years. And so I decided to start doing some of World Faith projects in Atlanta. And then it moved to Winston-Salem. And what I continuously found was that I was finally able to bring some people together that would have otherwise told me that they would have never met to do these service projects. But I wasn't able to do that single-handedly. I was able to do that because of the relationships I'd already built that were inspired by Dr. King. And I'm inspired by Dr. King continuously in this regard because he is pictured in marching from Selma to Montgomery, walking arm in arm with different religious leaders. The most famous of whom, the one of which I admire the most, is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who, if you have not heard of him, you should take a look at his book on the prophets. And this was, when I went to go look at this image, actually at the King Center in Atlanta, this struck me as incredibly profound. And because it was so evident to me at that time that Dr. King viewed his own faith as a means of cooperation, as a means for building a bridge. And he sought to find similarities, as he'd had previously with Gandhi and Hinduism, with Judaism, and then evidently Islam, as it was stated in the quote, and other philosophies and other traditions. So, and even at that time, before marching to Selma, Montgomery, King is quoted as having said that he called Gandhi the first person in history to lift the love ethic of Jesus above mere interaction between individuals to a powerful and effective social force. So King's experience with religious diversity in India obviously must have shaped the rest of his life. And he readily formed relationships, like I said, with Rabbi Abraham Heschel, and finding common ground in their common understanding of the Hebrew prophets. When the two are pictured walking arm in arm from Selma to Montgomery, it is a symbol of, it is to me the first symbol, major symbol of religious pluralism in this country. And what I mean by pluralism, it's not simply just having a diversity. We have a diversity in this room. We have Caucasian folks, we have African American folks, we have people that are of different religious traditions, Islam, I know Jews, Christians. But it's what you do with that diversity. It's that engagement of that diversity. It's an engagement in power. It's an engagement in the community, a collective engagement. And so Rabbi Heschel, after marching with Dr. King, is quoted as having said, "Our march was worship. I felt my legs were praying." And in this quote is the common understanding between Heschel and Dr. King, that the way of having a prophetic consciousness, required people to participate in this justice. And in participating in justice, you find common ground. You find people of similar stories, of similar concerns, of similar values, who are wanting to engage together and who can only have an impact in the community because of the relationships that they have with one another. And therefore, pluralism is very relational. It's the understanding that it's not my ability to affect you, it's also how you affect me. So, another interesting quote that I found was from Dr. King's famous sermon on A Time to Break Silence. And he says, This Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist belief about ultimate reality is that the force of love is the supreme unifying principle of life. And this really exemplified, was highlighted in an experience that I had as an intern with Change. I interned with Change this 2 summers ago as a full-time intern, and the program, the Religion and Public Engagement program that's headed by Dr. Viethouse in the Religion Department, was recently founded. And so I was doing a full-time internship with Change, but I coupled it with an independent study with Dr. Viethouse. And I was constantly being asked the questions by Dr. Viethouse of what is community? What does it mean to be a citizen? And when, of course, as the arrogant student, when she initially asked me these questions in our first meeting, I said, oh, that's easy, right? I mean, come on now, right? And then I was asked about a month and a half later by the statewide organizer for our affiliate, for Change's affiliate, to participate in a national campaign to cap interest rates on credit cards and loans at 10%. And he said, Mustafa, I want you to be the representative of Muslims and college students in our statewide campaign for that. I want you to prepare a theological response on usury and present it to religious leaders, clergy from around the state, politicians, bankers, CEOs, and tell them why, as a Muslim, this is important to you. This issue is important to you. And so I'm not any specialist in Islamic studies or anything, but I sat down for the next couple of weeks and I really divulged in the information, and I presented a very succinct, short paper. And at the end of presenting that paper, again, the statewide organizer, Gerald, said, Mustafa, that paper was so good and so impactful for us that we want you to speak in a couple weeks in Raleigh publicly about 2-3 minutes. Why, as a Muslim, as a Muslim and a college student, this issue is important to you? And I had a very profound revelation coming back from that meeting, going back home. And the thinking was, the thinking was actually inspired by the words of Dr. King in his last speech that he gave on the Vietnam War. He says that he is disappointed in America, but there is no great disappointment where there is no great love. And at times when I talk about the discourse that's placed on Muslims, or the agitation and the fear that's used to mobilize people against Islam, I have to remind myself that I'm just disappointed. But the real point of that was, I realized that that I love this country because I can be disappointed. The disappointment is exemplified in that as an American Egyptian Muslim, I'm allowed to participate. I'm capable of participating in its possibility. And who do I owe that to? I owe that largely to Dr. King. And Dr. King really, in that sense, revitalized the American dream. As an inspired Christian, he proclaimed that everybody should have an opportunity to participate in the public space, regardless of race, regardless of creed, regardless of ideology. That you as an individual, as a person of dignity, whose dignity is given by God, has the right to participate. And why I'm saying that he reframed the American dream is because I look back to one of the earliest sermons, important sermons in this country. It was delivered by John Winthrop. It's called The City Upon a Hill. If you haven't read that, it's another thing I would recommend. But John Winthrop talks about the United States, this community there, of shedding a beacon of light onto England, because of the religious pluralism that they were seeking. Now, granted, that pluralism was engaged in the right for them to practice as Christians, right, in their own faith. But this is a remarkable sermon, because we now have to look at that sermon within a modern context and say, well, what does that sermon mean today? What are the values of that sermon? The values of that sermon are the allowing to practice, the ability to practice your own interpretation of Christianity, and engage in community with people that are different from you. But now we have to recognize that it's not just the church or the steeple, that there are Jews that congregate on Friday evenings for Shabbat services, that Muslims congregate on Friday afternoons to the call to prayer, that Buddhists come together and sing their sanghas at the temples, and all while the church bells are going on in the middle of the city. And I think that is the case that, or one of the major visions of Dr. King is providing that new revitalized American dream. So let me close in making one last statement. One of the proverbs that I saw Dr. King cite a number of times in his different works and his speeches is Proverbs 18:21. And it says, life and death are in the power of the tongue. Another quote, another citation he often made was, we must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools. And that was a quote from Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And so, right now as an organizer, I'm looking at what's happened within the current political context. And particularly with the recent shootings in Tucson. Right? And what would Dr. King have to say about this? And I'm also thinking, well, now hold on. For Muslims, there was an experience that happened not too long ago called the Fort Hood shootings. And these were both equally terrible situations. And the one difference I can really find is that about twice as many people were killed in the case of the Fort Hood shootings. Right? I mean, the numbers are a little different. But the first 4 days after the Fort Hood shootings, MSNBC, Fox, CNN constantly looped the video footage of Major Hassan dressed in Islamic garb, and were constantly referencing, look, this is the image, right? He's Muslim, and there was an assumption in that first 4 days, the first week, even 2 weeks after that, he was a terrorist because he dressed in Islamic garb. Reportedly, two of the people that were at the scene said that he yelled Arabic before he did the attack. One of them said that he said Allahu Akbar. I mean, we don't really know, but the point is that he was stereotyped and objectified as being a Muslim, and that being the inspiration for his attacks. So let's go to the case of Jared Loughner. And Jared Loughner, after the attacks happened, up until the last couple days, you constantly saw in the newspaper, you constantly saw in the media, both right-wing and left-wing folks saying, you know what, he did it because he's a communist, because he's a liberal of liberals. Or he did it because he's a conservative. And both of them are equally as troubling, because the real drama for Dr. King, as exemplified in the first story told about with the lady that had stabbed him, was that the real drama doesn't take place in the action itself or the crime itself. The real drama starts in what you're going to do after that. And so, the last quote that I have here is that is again from Chaos or is again, where do we go from here? Chaos or community, where do we go from here? He says, the point of affirming that mankind's survival is dependent upon man's ability to solve the problems of racial injustice, poverty, and war. The solution of these problems is in turn dependent upon man squaring his moral progress with his scientific progress and learning the practical art of living in harmony. Some years ago, a famous novelist died. Among his papers was found a list of suggested story plots for future stories, the most prominently underscored being this one. Quote, a widely separated family inherits a house in which they have to live together. This is the great new problem of mankind. We have inherited a big house, a great world house, in which we have to live together, black and white, Easterners and Westerners, Gentiles and Jews, Catholics and Protestants, Muslim and Hindu, a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interest, who, because we can never again live without each other, must learn somehow in this one big world to live with each other. This means that more and more of our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. We must now give an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole in order to preserve the best in our individual societies. And so it is sort of with the summation of some examples of the work that I had done prior to being honored with the award and some of the stuff that I'm continuing to do, that I want to say that categorizing Dr. King as a racial icon is actually a dangerous thing and does an injustice to the multidimensionality and the power of his message, and that as a Muslim, I'm inspired by his ability and his conviction that interfaith, that pluralism, is the American promise. So, thank you. Any questions?
I have one.
Well, why don't you go ahead?
I enjoyed your speech. I wanted to hear, though, just a little bit about the mission of change.
Sure.
I'm vaguely familiar with it, but I've never known what the full mission of change is.
So, I'm not quite sure if John has passed it around or anything, but John is going to have a sign-up sheet for anybody who is interested in learning more about nonpartisan interfaith organizing or coming to a change event. We're trying to get some students involved in change and try to develop some community organizing, political leadership here within the student body of Wake Forest. But change, as was said before by Chris, is multi-faith and multiracial nonpartisan organization that has 53 dues-paying member congregations. And so the point of our community organizing is that out of our relationships that we have with each other in the community, we begin to understand and realize where the tensions lie, common tensions lie with people. Where are people agitated? How do people understand the world or the community as it is versus the world or the community as it should be? And oftentimes you'll find that there are issues in the community that are common across the board. Or you'll find injustices that are being placed upon a certain group of people that should not be taking place. And the commitment to doing that kind of work is really just based on the relationships. As an organizer, we are constantly trying to go across the Highway 52, the east and west, to bring people together. And a lot of times it's having a simple conversation with them that becomes very transformational. In light of talking a little bit more about change, I also want to point out, since the new U.S. Census is going to be coming out soon, it should be interesting. You might all want to take a look at that, because in 2000, a year before clergy came together in this city to bring change to life. The U.S. Census rated Winston-Salem the most segregated city in the United States. And so change has, in the past, worked with our congregations, which we have a network of about 23,000 people in the community, to go and do neighborhood audits. We've done audits in schools. We just finished a campaign with the public school system. We actually, after a couple of years of doing work in the community and gathering research and building relationships, we realized that the community was really in support of having nonpartisan elections for the school board, and that having partisan elections was actually limiting the capacity for people who wanted to be on the school board but wanted to be independent and not have a political party run. Also, people were understanding that education is not a partisan issue and that the partisan politics actually hinders the development and the progress of these schools. We also do projects like we do in a city like the Interfaith Youth Tour. We bring youth from our different congregations to 3 different ones so that they learn on a Sunday for a couple hours, so that they go around and they learn about each other's religious traditions. They have conversations about what's common, but also what are the differences, because it's a time to celebrate the diversity. So, as an organizer, I'm actually employed by the members of those 53 congregations, and I just help to develop the leadership and I help to empower them through the relationships that we built to participate in the democratic process. Do you have some question?
Yes, I was just a little curious. You probably said who inspired your Muslim faith. I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on that.
What? I'm sorry?
Who inspired your Muslim faith?
Who inspired my? Well, so I was born a Muslim, but that's an interesting question, and let me share with you a quick story about. I don't think that there's necessarily one person in this case, but it's experiences with people. In this past December, Change started developing a homeless caucus, which is basically bringing leaders from the homeless community together to discuss issues that are affecting them, to identify problems. And we actually had a meeting at First Baptist Church on Highland Avenue where we brought out about 70 folks from the homeless population, and we provided a catered meal for them, and we sat and we had conversations going through and trying to understand what the problems that they're facing. And that was the first time I engaged in some serious conversations with the homeless. And it's very empowering. And actually, 2 weeks ago, I was at work until very late in the office, and I really didn't have a reason for staying there. And I think this was sort of, God's touch or just some sort of perchance moment experience. But I left the office at 8:30, which is our office is downtown, and I was planning to head to Panera, actually off of Cloverdale. And I forgot that, when I got there, I forgot that Panera closes at 9. So there's a Mario's Pizza that's right next to it. So I parked my car there, and I was walking in, and there was a homeless gentleman walking inside the Mario's. And so when I walked in, he was asking the manager, who I'm very vaguely familiar with, if he could have free pizza. Now, the pizza place is open up another hour, so I know that the manager is not going to give him the pizza if he has it, because he's going to try and sell it, right? And so I intervened and I said, this pizza's on me. Whatever he wants, it's on me. And he said, really? I said, yeah, under one condition, that you sit down with me and you have a conversation with me and you tell me what your story is. His response was, I can sit here. And so we got the pizza, and we're sitting there talking, telling him a story. And he had recently gotten out of prison, and showing me his papers, and he had served in the military, so he was trying to head to High Point because there was a federal office in High Point that distributes the welfare for the veterans, right, the money from the government. And he had to fill out papers to resume getting those benefits. And so I told him, you know what, I'm going to take you to the bus station. I'm going to buy you a round-trip ticket to High Point for tomorrow, as long as you promise to come to a homeless caucus. So when I asked him that, here's my point, when I asked him that, he broke out into tears. And he said, what inspired you from your faith to do this? And so to be honest, a lot of times it's non-Muslims who are inspiring me, right? And it's I'm just thinking, this is the first thing that came to my mind when you asked me that question, because this story, as a person who was trying to go back to the love-centered ethic of Christ, trying to be a good person, really was the reason why I told him I'd give him the ticket. Right? And so I expressed him that, and he said, well, you know what? I'm shocked because nobody in the last 10 years has spoken up for me. But you're asking me to speak with you. And to be goddamn honest, I never expected it to be Muslim. So, I guess that's one answer I have for you.
Can you talk about why you were engaged in at Wake and how because your mission's manifested here?
Sure. Yeah, so I graduated in May 2010, and I majored in religion and I minored in philosophy and Middle East studies. I spent most of my time, actually my second semester of sophomore year, I started the Muslim Students Association. And there was already an interfaith council here at Wake Forest, and so I tried to move them more from just kind of be people that get together and talk about interfaith stuff to doing programming. And so we did a handful of showings of movies. We also did a handful of conversations. We brought a couple of speakers. One example of an interesting event we did was we brought the PBS documentary Prince Among Slaves, and we brought in conjunction with that one of the historians for that film. And basically what the film was showing was that Islam has always been a part of the American identity because the slaves that came from Africa, a number of them were Muslim. And so it was really highlighting that part of the narrative. The other things that we did a number of service projects. For instance, the Interfaith Council worked with the community mosque locally to raise money, donations and foods for their pantry. And the pantry at the community mosque is interesting because they don't just give it to poor folks. They label them disinherited people. So it's people that are handicapped. It's people that are out of a job. It's people that are sick, and they're paying medical bills and they can't afford. So we actually raised about $250-$60 in a couple days for that with students. So I think probably the most lasting thing though that I was involved in was my senior year. I had a fellowship with the Interfaith Youth Corps, as I had mentioned, and one of the things we had to do in September was to meet with people from across the board in the university, to have one-on-one meetings with them, to gather their stories, and to tell their own story, and then also to see what resources that they had access to, and just to do an analysis. And I wrote, it ended up being like a 40-page thing I put together of who needs to be in relationship to who and with what for having a sustainable engagement in religious pluralism. And so it resulted largely in the creation of the Religious Life Advisory Council, which is made up of staff and faculty and students that meet once a month, and I believe Reverend Chris Tolles here at Wake Forest is in charge of putting those meetings together. So, and that body really just addresses issues of living on campus. How can Muslims, Jews, Christians, people of no faith, all different backgrounds, right, can live in the same space, and how can we satisfy their needs, their religious or faith-based needs. So, any other questions? Sure.
One question, just was going to offer some more on change.
Sure, go ahead, please.
Since I've been a member for, well, since 2000, I think it was a year after it was started that I got into it through Temple Emmanuel. Is that okay to just share?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I don't want to take away.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
And I thought maybe that might be interesting to some of you since you're asking questions about change. And I got into it because through Temple Emmanuel, my son is Jewish. I'm Christian, but I was raising him Jewish, and being in the school system, and I saw that they were interested in school issues of race and religion and all these things, and so that's when I started getting involved. It's been an incredible experience for me. I've been in and out of it off and on due to my own health, but I met the ministers at the ministers' conference through Change, and it was kind of one of those things. I was just there. Somebody said they were going to the ministers' conference. I said, "Oh, I've heard of them." I knew they were part of Change, so I went and met them. If you know who the ministers' conference of Winston-Salem vicinity is, maybe you don't, but they are a group of black and white and different sects of Christianity. I don't know if anybody. It's Christian, yeah. But anyway. And then through them, I was able to actually bring a Darfurian here to Winston-Salem to speak to and raise the awareness of what was going on in Darfur, because the ministers hosted that for me. And so, just getting to know people and making connections and sharing stories. Change has been a wonderful vehicle for me to get more involved in my community, and also just to be involved in our political processes. And it's fabulous. It's not easy at times, but it's been brilliant too. It's good things.
Do we have another hand up?
Sure. Did you get the 10% cap?
No. That that's a pretty tough. I mean, the banks, the corporations, government is extremely well organized. And so that is a monumental effort. But we've had actually some successes within the state concerning foreclosures. And a number of CEOs of banks, and actually just clicking on the thing, that we're next week we're meeting with the CEO of BB&T to talk about these foreclosures, and they've been very interested in building relationships. They've been reaching back out to us, and so we've had some success with that. And so that's obviously, I think, a symptom, a component of the issue with usury.
At least the banks are talking now.
Well, at least the banks are talking. At least,
yeah.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that I never thought that a CEO would want to meet with me of a bank, right? I mean, so it is a monumental effort. It might be impossible, very well might be, but what it does say is that when you do have relationships across the board, when you're able to pack a room full of people, black and white, brown, Muslim, whatever, right? And you bring them to the meeting, and you say, "We want this done." It's a radical move because it's not a part of the normative discourse of how things are done, but it's incredibly powerful. So if anybody's interested in getting more information or meeting if you just want to get involved in organizing at your own whim, please get in touch with me. So just sign up, and I have cards if you guys want my contact information. And I'll be here to talk some more for a little while. So, yeah. Thank you.